Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture number 9 in the history series. How many modernisms are there? I'm going to start with a couple of remarks about Clement Greenberg, the modernist critic, because sometimes he's identified with modernism, but that identification is not uniform around the world, so it's important to, first of all, put a little perspective on the idea of Greenberg and modernism. And then we're going to look at other modernisms, Northern European ones, some ones from the east of Europe and other parts of Europe, and some non-European modernisms. So first of all, some assumptions about Greenberg. I think because the North American textbook market and art history market is so large, it produces most of the world's art history texts and a number of widely read journals, I think there's an assumption that Clement Greenberg's ideas about modernism were famous and influential around the world. And that's definitely not the case. That's a photograph with Clement Greenberg second from left at Jackson Pollock and Helen Frankenthaler and Lee Krasner. So Greenberg's influence is actually very uneven. In the late 20th century, he wasn't much read in Latin America. He wasn't taught in Spain. There was no conference on Greenberg in Mexico until around 2000. So very uneven in his influence in Spanish-speaking parts of the world. On the other hand, there are other parts of the world where a study of Greenberg is currently increasing. Greenberg wasn't translated into Chinese until 2009, and interest in and conferences on Greenberg and writings about Greenberg continue to expand in some parts of the world. So the result is that different parts of the world have different ideas about mid-century modernism that don't accord with assumptions in North American art history. There's also the question of what I like to call the reduced Greenberg, because even in North American Anglophone countries like Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and so on, Greenberg is more often cited than he is actually read. So he's actually known in simplified versions. For example, modernism is mostly associated with aesthetics and postmodernism with anti-aesthetics, meaning that modernism is thought of as pursuit, or Greenberg's idea of modernism is thought of as pursuit of aesthetic qualities, whereas postmodernism had interest in social contexts and politics. So modernism is associated with vision and visuality, just the pure act of looking and the pure visuality of the canvases and sculptures and so on. And postmodernism tends to be associated with institutions and politics by default, because Greenberg represents that idea of modernism. It's not entirely consistent with what Greenberg wrote. He wrote a fair amount on politics, and he had different ideas that are not reflected in those reduced versions of him. And I think most important is that modernism tends, especially in Anglophone scholarship, to be associated with judgments of value and quality, because Greenberg was definitely given to saying that a given work was just good or bad. So he definitely made ad hoc judgments that he didn't justify. But he also wrote at length and very eloquently with his reasons for judging the way that he did. So it's a reduced version of Greenberg to think that modernist critics basically just judged without giving reasons, and that they judged based on visual appearances and the look or the power of the work. So as a result of both of those things, the uneven reception of Greenberg around the world, and also the fact that many people don't read him at length, as a result, and also in general, because texts don't travel as quickly as just plain reproductions, there have been multiple modernisms around the world, multiple ideas of modernism, with divergent ideas about what was happening in Western Europe and North America. Multiple modernisms as a subject has been studied in art history since around 2000. Before then, it was assumed that Western European and North American modernism was the original, the most important, the only essential modernism, and that all the others in other countries around the world were echoes, which are not necessary for understanding 20th century art. And that's why textbooks of art history, even textbooks of 20th century art history, continue to tell the story of modernism in Western Europe and North America, especially as refracted through these versions of Greenberg, as the single necessary story of modernism and imply, by doing that, that you could understand another modernism, Romanian modernism, Paraguayan modernism, by studying the central story. Modernism, in Greenberg's way of thinking of things, was a single enterprise, and other parts of the world just had to catch up. So that particular kind of Eurocentrism, that North Atlantic centrism, does reflect Greenberg. The expression multiple modernisms comes from the expression multiple modernities, which was coined by the sociologist Shmuel Eisenstadt, and it was imported into art and art history by a number of different people, including Mika Ball and Terry Smith, some others that will show up in other lectures. So the rest of this lecture is a look at multiple modernisms starting inside Europe and moving outward to try to understand the different ways that they've been understood other than as reflections of the single central narrative. So to begin with a Northern European modernism. There's a standard story of art, which is in all textbooks, all accounts of the art of the last 100 years, which we're going to study in more depth in lecture 20. And that standard story, which I think I sometimes call the master narrative or the story of art in general, it starts either in the ancient Middle East or with Greece and Rome, and it follows a very predictable trajectory. So if it starts in ancient Greece, it then goes to ancient Rome, and then it goes to France for the Middle Ages. And then after the Middle Ages, it goes back to Italy for the Italian Renaissance. And then after the Renaissance, it goes back to France and also the rest of Europe for the Baroque and Neoclassicism and movements, including and up to 19th century modernism and early 20th century modernism in the first couple decades of the 20th century, and then finally across the Atlantic for US mid-century art. That's the standard story of art, or the master narrative. It can start at different places. You can start it in Sumeria. You could start it in Egypt. You can start it as far back as Lascaux and the Venus figurines and so on in prehistoric cultures. And you could start it in different parts of the world. But this is the central zigzagging between Northern and Southern Europe, and then the trip across the Atlantic for the rest of modernism. This is the standard story that leads up to international contemporary art. So there's an art historian, Robert Rosenblum, who had an idea of a slightly different trajectory that involving Northern Europe. He didn't approve of all that French art, so he had this way of telling a story of modernism that would, quote, avoid Paris. He proposed to start with early 19th century German romantic art like Caspar David Friedrich, which is the painting on the left, and then to look at his influence on Scandinavian expressionism like Edvard Munch, which you see at the top right. And ultimately, the idea is that these streams of art led to abstract expressionism, like Pollock, like you see on the lower right. So this is a way of thinking about modernism without making yet another trip to Paris. If you were to put Rosenblum's key artists and movements on a timeline and compare it with the standard model, the two would look quite different. The standard model, or the master narrative, is up at the top. It would start at the upper left in the French Academy. It would include Friedrich and people like that. And then you'd have a lot of French artists, post-impressionists, Cubists, Monet, Cézanne, Picasso, and so on. But on the bottom timeline, Rosenblum's emphasis is Northern European. So instead of the French interval between, in this timeline, 1850 and, say, 1920, instead of that, you go up to Scandinavia, you look at expressionism as in Munch, and also people like Emil Nolde, who worked in the very north of Germany, on the border with Denmark, almost Scandinavian himself, and then across the Atlantic for Rothko and abstract expressionism. That would include Pollock as well. That trip across the Atlantic is usually associated with this book by Serge Guibault, How New York Stole the Idea of Modern Art. And Guibault is a very different art historian than Rosenblum. His idea was that it wasn't just aesthetic and stylistic qualities that made New York City central, but it was an ideology of anti-communist liberalism popular after the Second World War, and that was what enabled New York to steal the idea of modern art. But the result is the same kind of trajectory. So at the top, there's the standard narrative of modernism centered in Paris, with New York stealing modern art, quote unquote. And at the bottom, that would be Rosenblum's alternative story beginning in Germany. The problem with alternative narratives like this one is that they rarely have been able to compete with more familiar stories. And this is a problem that we'll see a number of times in the following lectures. You can invent these alternate genealogies, these lineages, these different kind of trajectories, but to make them plausible and get them generally accepted is a completely different question, because the master narrative of modern art in particular is really tenacious, and because it saw itself as universal, and modernists within that narrative looked at people practicing in other parts of the world and imagined that they were just followers. So these alternative narratives usually don't take hold in art history, and Rosenblum's certainly hasn't. So to widen the circles a little bit, just a sampling of other European modernisms. First of all, Hungary. Hungarian modernism is actually one of Europe's largest modernist art movements. So we're talking about art from the beginning of the 20th century all the way up through the 30s and 40s, up until the mid-century and the period after the Second World War. This is an artist named Perot Csaba Vilmos. In Hungarian names, the family name comes first, like in Chinese practice. So he practiced a mixture of 19th century Hungarian academic influences and realist influences with Cézanne and Picasso. This is really a kind of a tip of the iceberg thing. I'm just going to show a couple of slides with just one artist each, but there are many exhibitions and many books on Hungarian modernists, and there are dozens of interesting Hungarian modernists. The movement is comparable in volume almost to French or German and other Western European modernist movements. Another enormous modernist movement is Czechoslovak modernism, and in particular Cubism. Czech Cubism was one of the largest movements in the world. One of their artists, Bohumil Kubista, was one of maybe 24 or so artists active right around the period in which Picasso was working in his analytic cubist mode. Kubista began as an expressionist. He had a group called Ozma, and he had very close contact with Picasso and others in Paris. This movement, like Hungarian modernism, is probably not in your survey book unless you went to school in Central or Eastern Europe, where they have different surveys texts. But otherwise, other than that, you would have to go out of your way to see it in special exhibitions, and you'd have to go and find the painting because it's largely ignored outside of specialists and outside of the Czech Republic. But as a movement, it's almost as large as Parisian and other Western European practices of Cubism at the time, and very well informed and very self-reflective about what it was doing. Poland is another really large modernist movement, and all I'm showing you here as my one token is actually an example of tokenism, you might say. It was done in a very well-meaning way by actually a really excellent art historian, Peter Seltz, but you can see from the cover that that's a publication of the Museum of Modern Art. This was one of their many boutique exhibitions, smaller exhibitions showcasing modernisms outside of the master narrative. And this is typical of the way that these modernisms were represented outside of their countries. And the last of these European examples, just because I have to stop somewhere and I can't go on to all the members of the European Union, but it's Romania. It's a smaller modernism, but it was also a very strong movement, active until the dictatorship in Romania started in 1938. And modernisms like these can be seen in the national museums in the countries, but also they can be difficult to find because the artists often have house museums, museums in the towns where they grew up, that kind of thing, which are not always easy to get to. This particular artist, a really interesting artist, Teodor Paladi, has a museum right in Bucharest in Romania, so it's relatively easy to get to. But others like Bulgarian modernist artists can be harder to see. Not only because they don't travel outside their country, but even if you go to the country, you have to travel in order to see them. So despite international global art, they're still quite isolated, and they're still ideologically isolated, and they're still conceptually marginalized, despite all of the scholarship in the last 20 or so years on multiple modernisms. So a little bit on non-European modernisms. Among South American countries, Argentina had one of the earliest and most diverse responses to European modernisms beginning around 1916. This is a painting by Emilio Petteruti, who organized a Cubist exhibition in Buenos Aires in 1924. And there were about a half dozen different artist groups and movements, including mid-century abstraction in Argentina. Despite all of that, when Clement Greenberg visited Argentina, which apparently he did twice, I was told that on one of these visits, when he was leaving at the airport, he told one of his hosts, "You have all the materials for modernism. You could have a modernist movement here." In other words, he didn't recognize what they had done as a proper modernist movement. It was still too far from the central concerns of the artist that he was promoting, that he was interested in. The Philippines also had a modernist movement. And like a number of artists who lived at a distance from Europe, this artist, Edades, encountered modernism in a traveling exhibition. In this case, it was the Armory Show, famous Armory Show, which caused a scandal when it toured North America because it introduced a lot of North Americans to Duchamp and Matisse and others for the first time. So Edades was actually in North America and went back to the Philippines in 1928. In other cases, the traveling shows go to places nearer the countries and can spark modernist movements. And there are also many cases of exhibition catalogs and other reproductions inspiring modernist artists and modernist movements when they don't see any of the originals. That Armory Show, by the way, most famous for Duchamp's nude descending a staircase. It scandalized the students here at the School of the Art Institute. They were scandalized by Matisse's blue nude, and they made an effigy of Matisse out of straw, and they dragged it around the Art Institute, stabbing it, and then threw it in the garbage. That was our conservative student body at the time of the Armory Show. Egypt also had a very interesting modernist movement. This person, Mahmoud Said, was a graduate of the Académie Julienne, which is an institution that welcomed foreigners, unlike the major academy in Paris, the École des Beaux-Arts. So a number of people educated there went back to different countries and were influenced by their experience in Paris in the Académie Julienne as opposed to the École des Beaux-Arts. Egypt also developed a strong surrealist movement, and there was also a school of Cubism beginning in the 1940s. There were a number of movements that rejected European influence. They were quite aware of what they were doing, critical of Europeanization, critical of modernization. So some of these modernisms were often turned to themes that would now be called decolonial or post-colonial. And others were much more bent on emulation of the center, but neither one of those strategies helped them to find their way into the master narrative in Anglophone textbooks. My last example, just because I have to stop somewhere, is Pakistan. So a number of these modernisms started significantly later than European modernisms, and in Pakistan, the first modernist exhibition was actually set up by a woman artist, Zubaida Agha, shortly after the creation of Pakistan in 1947. These later modernisms, the ones that started, say, 20, 30, 40 years later than the artists that they were emulating, they're especially likely to be ignored in art history that's written in Europe and North America. Even very large late modernisms like India's, they are, and the largest ones tend to produce their own scholars whose work is not always read outside their region because they attempt to justify the art of their region or of their country in ways that are not legible or persuasive to people who read them from the position of some center. These are all themes that we'll return to. So I have two screens by way of concluding this. So this kind of survey could be extended into a whole year of study. The problem is that if you survey things this way, if you do it, at length and in detail, it can make it seem as if there isn't any real obstacle to solving this problem, to putting modernisms all together. The problem is, though, that Greenberg's sense of modernism is still very strong, and his sense of modernism was that modernism was universal, and the avant-garde was the most important aspect of it, so that when you had one innovator, one Pollock or one Picasso, then you don't need to study the other ones because they're following. A little bit like the model of science, like if somebody discovers E equals mc squared, it doesn't really matter if someone else discovers it after him. It's a kind of universalizing idea that's built into the self-understanding of modernism. So sometimes if you add, people have tried creating sort of composite texts that add multiple modernisms, they can still appear as if they weren't really necessary. So in the art world, this problem of less important modernisms disappeared with the growth of international art market after the 1960s. So this problem is specific to modernisms, this problem of multiple modernities. It didn't exist before modernism because that was the first self-consciously internationalist or universalist art movement, and it doesn't happen after modernisms because the international art market basically erased the problem by allowing art to exist simultaneously in many parts of the world. So this may also seem like a kind of problem for academics only, and in a sense that's true, because this problem still exists in classrooms and in textbooks and in activities of scholars, the symposia and so on. These lingering marginalization of these other modernisms is not a resolved problem, it can't be solved, at least by accumulating modernisms. The standard narrative of modernism, the master narrative, is still used in textbooks all around the world, and it continues to stress European and North American modernism and ignore the others, even while there's a tremendous amount of work in different parts of the world looking at each one of these modernisms one by one. I think of this as a kind of maybe black hole is too strong, but it's a part of art history that has unresolved issues in it that are not the same as issues in other parts of art history. Can only hope that, like, in the future, there will be narratives that can that can persuasively overturn some of the assumptions of the master narrative that's associated, rightly or wrongly, with Greenberg.